Hi, I'm Valerie Steffen, part of Bright's training team, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation. We're so glad you're here. I'm excited to share with you today the Bright MLS T3 Home Demand Index. And right off the bat, to answer one of the most common questions I saw pouring in, the index is included in its entirety as part of your subscription to Bright. So it's not a premium or an add-on product. It's part of the core service that we offer to you with your subscription. So what we're going to talk about today is accessing the report itself and lots of detail about how the index is created so you'll be able to use it confidently. And we'll talk through various uses and ways that you might use it in your prospecting or working with buyers or sellers or as part of, your social media or marketing yourself and prospecting. So I'll interweave answers to the questions that we've received about the reports as we go along. So at its essence, what is this new report? Well, in brief, the Bright MLS T3 Home Demand Index, or HDI as I'll probably call it, it is a bit of a mouthful, tracks the level of interest through pre-purchase activity to demonstrate home buying demand in a specific market or markets. And right now, the initial markets covered are Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. That will expand coverage later on this year, probably about the third quarter, to more of Bright's footprint. A proprietary algorithm is used, and it incorporates things like buyer reviews, real estate agent views, showing appointments, and some listing and sale data to determine the index. And this is really unprecedented because it's a near real-time user experience, letting you know what's happening now and allowing you to anticipate upcoming market conditions. The index allows real estate professionals and their clients to sort of put their ear to the ground of the housing market in an entirely new way. The report was developed with management and real estate consulting firm T360. So in terms of what this means to you, whether you're looking to grow your market expertise, share that insight into housing demand as part of your marketing efforts, whether you're trying to target your prospecting efforts, guide sellers with compelling arguments for pricing it right, or present buyers with strategies for a sound investment and offering strategy, the Home Demand Index really is a game changer. The question is really, how are you going to use it to drive your business forward? And we're going to dig deeper into where you may use various aspects of the report and suggested use cases as we walk through the Home Demand Index. So enough overview, let's jump in. So the report itself can be found under the Market menu. You'll find it under the heading Market Resources. And just to pause here for a second to address a couple of related questions that I've received a lot, and that's, how do I learn more and how do I explain this to my client? Well, obviously you're in the right place to learn more by being part and present at this webinar. And we're hoping that you're getting the information you need for your narrative or talk track. But we've also provided documentation on the material in our integrated guide that's right on the menu. So if you click on the little I badge right beside Home Demand Index, you'll see it opens up a quick tip with an embedded video that gives you an overview of the report, a little definition, and a link to learn more. And if you click on the Learn More, it's going to take you to an article that has, again, an integrated video, links to access the report, an explanation, additional news and resources, even an interview with our CEO, Brian Dinellen, and the chairman and CEO, Stefan Swanpol, that talked about the development and really the value for brokers and agents. So all really good resources that, again, you can access right from within Bright itself. Now, if you click on Home Demand Index, it's going to take you into the homedemandindex.com site. So this link can actually be shared with your clients if you want them to have access to the report and all of this information. You can, of course, screen grab or share whatever aspects of this that you'd like as well, if that's your preference. Just make sure you give credit where credit is due and your source for information. So another great place to access help and information is using the About link at the top of the page. And this will give you some really helpful background and some easy explanations to share context about the report. So at the top, we have an overview that kind of explains the index. It's going to give you a summary that if you are sharing this with a client, that you can explain to them, what is an index if they've never been exposed to one before, that essentially it's a score and it incorporates data on pre-sale activities. So not sort of the browsing that maybe folks may be doing at third-party sites. It's not that sort of casually looking at houses. It's what agents are doing on behalf of buyers and what buyers are doing in terms of viewing listings from their agents and what serious buyers are doing in terms of showing activity across different geographies and home types in the residential market. If you scroll down a little bit more, you'll see there's a nice chart here that's talking about the differentiators for this index. I know in speaking with real estate professionals that you have tons of stats coming at you from all angles, including there's a lot of different statistical reports in Bright. So what's the difference? What makes the home demand index something worth paying attention to? And just to be clear, the home demand index is not intended to necessarily replace those reports. Rather, it's meant to be a complement. So this gives us an illustration of sort of the differentiation. So traditional indexes have a focus on sort of a backward view. They're focused on what's already happened in the market, and it's what happened, months and sometimes even a quarter in the past, because it's reporting on pended and sold information. Whereas the Bright MLS T3 Home Demand Index, it has that past data, but the focus is on, again, pre-purchase activity. So those activities that are leading to sales. And in looking at that demand, we're able to determine what's happening in near real time and potentially what's likely to happen in the future. So I heard a really great analogy from Jack Miller from T360. He explained it sort of as if you're thinking about, maybe like a retail shopping model. If you work at a store, at the mall, and you run register receipts, those are great, right? So those are valuable for letting you know what sales were. So, if it's monthly sales or quarterly sales, great. That's great information to have. That's what a typical index or stats report focuses on. But if you want to look at things like, how many people were shopping at the mall today, and who were those folks that were shopping, and what stores were they visiting, or if it's a clothing store, what clothes did they try on, or if it's a car dealership, what cars were they taking for a test drive? Those are going to get you an idea of where sales are more currently or what sales will be. And that's where you would look at the home demand index. So those are the types of things that we're interested in. So sold data is sort of old data, essentially, which has its place and is helpful certainly for some uses. But if you're looking for advising or working with an active seller or buyer or targeting your own prospecting efforts, more current data is certainly going to be very useful as well. So if we scroll down a little farther, we're going to see a map and a representation of the three markets that I mentioned: the Philadelphia market, the Baltimore market, and the Washington, D.C. market. These primary markets were determined in combination with subscriber focus groups and were supported by the data we were looking at. They're not necessarily the groups that say, are used for the U.S. Census, but these were the natural market areas at the MLS market level. So finally, scrolling down a little bit further, we have short descriptions for a little more information about Bright MLS and about T360. So again, if you're explaining this or giving context to someone who's not familiar with the industry, it might be helpful to include that information as well. I'll also point out in the top right-hand corner, we have an FAQ. This is, again, another area that would be great to familiarize yourself with. I won't kind of read through each one of these. We're going to talk about them as we kind of go through and look at the site itself. But again, if you need to go back and reference, if you're, the client you're sharing this with has some questions, these are good to include. So for instance, those specific regions, this is a breakdown of what counties and what cities are included in the Philadelphia Metro, the Baltimore Metro, and the Washington, D.C. Metro. This is a great one. What are the market activity ratings? So when we say an index or a score, that home demand index was created, and then within that index, there's a breakout called a market activity rating. So the baseline of the home demand index is 100, and the numbers or the score that's come up with for each one of the markets, home types, zip codes, is compared against that. Is it above or is it below that baseline of 100? So where does it fall in terms of on a scale from limited to high? And just again, for your reference, the number or the baseline that we used, because an index needs to have a base that we compare it against, and that was 2019 as the baseline. So all future activities are measured against the baseline, and the algorithm crunches really some very big data to establish that. So for example, as I mentioned previously, we use home showing information, and there were over 135,000 pieces of showing data from the last month alone. So, oof. In terms of context then, so we have our 3 markets up here at the top that we can navigate to. And let's just click on the first one, Washington, D.C. And when you take a look, to give you additional context, if you scroll down this page, you actually are going to have a home demand index for each month back to October of 2020. Now, your most recent home demand index report is going to always be at the top. So let's take a look at what's included in this overview. And I can really use this as a way to start getting to know my market in general. So the first thing to take in where the market activity rating is. And the home demand index, as it's showing for March of 2021, is moderate for DC overall. It's at 117, putting it at the second highest level. We can see right beside it that the demand has risen from the previous month's 101, and that's a rise of 15.8%. And it's where we'd seasonally expect it to be based around last year's index of 116. So that's less than a percentage point above where it was last year. So it would be safe to say if you're looking, maybe you're working with a seller, to say to them that it's a market that's in their favor. Demand is there, and here are the stats to back it up. Similarly, if you're representing a buyer in this market, you'd want to make sure that they're armed with this information as they're working on offers. A great way to digest this information and sort of put it into context is to use the summary that's provided in the overview. This interpretation of market conditions is provided by Dr. Paul Bishop, who's an economist who's worked with NAR. So this area is sort of the initial taste for the information, and we'll want to dig deeper, and we can do that by clicking View Details in the top right-hand corner. So once we're here in the details, we'll see the initial report at the top is a repeat of what we were just looking at, and we can either click to go to the next specific section of the report we're interested in, or we can scroll down further. Next, we come to a historical year-over-year comparison. And now that we get a chance to see this, we sort of see a fuller scope of seasonality and a deeper view of past behavior. This is going to display sort of a rolling 12 months. The orange line is showing the most recent 12 months, and the blue line is a year previous. So in looking at this, your eye probably shoots immediately to the March-April dip, where COVID threw the market for a loop. Then in May, we see pent-up demand pitching the line back up and keeping demand over 2019 for the rest of the year. In October through December, we see a drop-off as we'd expect, where things slow down through the colder months and holidays. And in January to February, we're pretty much where we'd anticipate the market being, starting to pick up for spring. You can hover on any of the points to see what the specific score was for that time period. And again, we have a nice summation of conditions, so letting us know and easily explain or translate to a customer that we're speaking to low mortgage rates, an improving economy, and the desire by some buyers to purchase a larger home contributing to recent demand. So very digestible. Drilling still down further, we can scroll down to the home demand index map. And the home demand indexes are color coded. And you'll see at the very bottom here, we have a legend that lets us know kind of what the colors represent. Again, if you hover on the individual zip, you can see a pop-up with additional information, lets you know what the code is specifically, what city is most closely indicated with that individual zip code. The map is really, to me, such a clear illustration of how localized real estate can be. If you're in a city, it may be, a block to block difference in terms of demand. And looking at the zip code level, if you're in a city, you can have the highest in dark orange, and it can be, right next to a limited zip, which is in dark blue. The table beside the map is sorted highest to limited, so my mind immediately went to the use of that information in prospecting efforts. If you're wanting to reach out to prospect to potential sellers to create inventory, you may want to grab, the high demand areas as places that you want to say target to create inventory through your prospecting efforts. And you could, take these zip codes or the cities that are associated, and you can go to Remine or you can go to Bright's public records, pop that information in and create labels. And to me, a screen grab of this to include in your marketing efforts is just a really great illustration. Again, make sure you're adding, your insight when you're sharing this. Don't share just information. You want to share, the interpretation or your insight for it. You can do that on social media, your blog, tell prospects or followers how they can use this information to help themselves. So if you're working with buyers or sellers, this localized understanding is going to help their market positioning. If I'm coming into a high index area with a buyer, I need to have the I need to have the expectation that I'll likely be in a multi-offer situation. And that certainly should inform the offers that I make. And as a seller, I need to prepare myself, if I'm in one of those high demand areas, that I'm probably going to have an onslaught of showings. And, it may impact my pricing strategy. So this is a really great illustration too, if you happen to be working with a seller who also plans on buying. Maybe they're changing their geography. So where does their current home fall versus the area that they're moving to if they're changing those geographies? If they're in a slow or limited zip code where they're selling and they're planning to move to a higher demand area where they may have a tougher time getting an offer in, do they want to sell first in that situation or vice versa? So note that for the zips that are very tight, that are very close together, you can always use the search zip code box at the bottom if you want to zoom in to narrow and just view one particular zip code. So moving on, as our time grows tight here, you also can drill down to demand and inventory by home type. So we keep getting closer and closer to give sort of a more specific view of the market. Again, we have an economist overview letting us know that all home types had a rise in interest in February, but the highest interest in this marketplace was the higher end of the price spectrum for single family and condos. And is likely not a surprise to everyone working in DC, buyers found their home search challenging based around the amount of available inventory and demand. So you can scroll through all of the home types, or if you want to zip to a specific option you're interested in, you can click on the quick navigation links here. I do want to note that if you happen to be looking in Baltimore or Philadelphia, the market segmentation will be different. They're different markets, so different price segmentation will apply there, but they always have 6. So let's scroll through and just at a glance, you can see the confirmation of that overview. As the higher our price goes, the higher demand increases. So for instance, if we look at single family homes above 950,000, our home demand index is high. So the market activity rating was at 146 high, up from 121 the previous month and 138 the prior year. So our months of inventory is 2, which happens to be the highest of the market segments. Our average daily inventory last month was 534, and inventory sold last month was 270. So inventory levels relative to other segments, not terrible. Lots of showings and views, but a decent amount of inventory. So if I was explaining this as part of, say, a CMA or a listing presentation, I'd point to the index growth or, shopping demand, if you want to explain it in more layman's terms, from last month to this month, and certainly comment on the seasonality. So we're higher than we'd be typically, as shown by the number from the prior year. And let them know that there is competition in their market segment, which is what we see by the average daily inventory, the months of inventory and solds for last month. I think it's so crucial sort of in establishing credibility, especially during a listing presentation, to show the numbers. So show numbers they can't get elsewhere and let the market speak to their strategy. Making this part of something you share regularly makes the argument for things like price changes, if you're on the market long enough to need a price change, or strong buyer offers if you're on the other side of the table. If we scroll down a bit and we go to, say, townhouse row house twin for all prices, we've got a report demonstrating a market where shopping activity is moderate, second only to highest, but we've got nearly all the daily inventory sold. So what can we anticipate for buying a townhouse, in the coming weeks? How can we use that info to help inform a buyer's offer? Or if we go back up to condos, less than 570, here we are. Definitely a lot of interest, rising demand, above seasonal expectations. We're looking a little healthier in terms of available inventory, so perhaps less pressure for offers. So this is really all about better intelligence through sort of looking into a window on shopping experiences. These reports are so great for helping set expectations for our current situation, and to some degree helping to get a feel for what likely may be developing. Now, I'll also make a pitch for using the market performance reports if you want to drill down even further at, say, a school district or subdivision neighborhood, or even, looking at properties with a certain number of beds or baths level. That's a whole nother webinar, so I won't get into that, but I will encourage you to make use of The documentation at support.brightmls.com or videos on youtube.com/brightmls that talk about the market performance reports if you've never used them before. They also live under the market menu. Those are also using anticipatory pre-purchase behaviors to give you information. So really good stuff. They're available for the entire Bright footprint, not just the 3 big markets. Check them out. So at this point, let's look at some of the technical questions that we received, and we're lucky to have answers from T360's president, Jack Miller, for some of the help here. Our first question has to do with a perceived overlap with our existing reports, things like smart charts. Is there an overlap there?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the big, and we have had some vendors say to us like, hey, are you guys building a replacement for some reporting tool that is out in the industry? And I think the biggest difference with the home demand index is that we're really comparing it to national housing indexes. We have an economist that's looking at this data with us. So it's more of an evaluative, analytical type of tool as opposed to a reporting tool. So, and I think most of us are used to using reporting tools. We're used to pulling our favorite reports from whatever tool we use, whether it's Smart Chart or an MLS report or things like that. And those are great, and keep using those. If they provide you value, that's amazing. What this is for getting a perspective on what's happening in the market, what the activity and demand level is, and having, again, that expert economics copy that we have written every month about these different parts of the market and what's going on with those parts of the market. So that's really, for me, the key differentiator. And we see this as not a reporting product, but as it's an index and with economics thinking and analysis.
Great. Next, we have a question. How is 100 the base of the index? Does a score of 100 mean a normal market? And does that correlate with a buyer's market or a seller's market or months of supply of demand?
That's a great question. So the 100 this is what's different about a housing index. Housing indexes in general, tend to baseline off of a point in time. They'll pick a point in time and say, we're going to start that point in time as our baseline, and then we're going to measure against that baseline over time. So we baselined on 2019 activity data. So a 100 represents the baseline from the 2019 activity data. It's probably really good we didn't baseline off of 2020 because it was such a wild year, but 2019 was our baseline activity. So we expect, you'll see this in all indexes, is that there's going to be, if there's more and more activity, you'll see some natural drift up. So 100 was what was normal for the market in 2019. But, as communities grow, as there's more housing, as there's more stuff going on, you may see that, 110 might become kind of the norm for the level of shopping activity. So that's how that baseline works. That's why the 100. And again, this is coming from the world of indexes and economics, where they want to pick a point in time and compare everything back to that and say, how are we doing versus that original measurement, so that we have a consistent view of what's going on.
Okay. Can you clarify the relationship between the home demand index and months of supply in inventory? So somewhat related to our previous question. I think this is coming from, these aren't always what we expect. Like, you'd expect a seller's market to show a high demand and vice versa for a buyer's market. We don't always see that here.
Is if you have limited inventory, then that can depress the amount of shopping that's going on, the amount of people that are actually out there looking at homes or doing showings. It doesn't mean that you're not in a seller's market, right? Because if there's limited inventory and there's more buyers than there are sellers, then you are in a seller's market and you should advise your clients. But it's a different situation than if you have limited inventory and a ton of demand where there's a lot of people looking and showing. That's where you're going to get in those multiple offer situations consistently. That's where you're going to be like, it's going to be a real pandemonium, right? So that's the difference, because there's just, in some markets, there's just less inventory for people to look at. So there's not as many showings happening. There's not as many views happening. But even in that situation, if you were consulting with the seller, you say, look, we're still in a seller's market. There's still people shopping and buying. You can look at the inventory numbers and say, here's what's selling every month. I still think we can price aggressively, but that's different than limited inventory, and a lot of people shopping. Limited inventory and a lot of people shopping, that's just different. So that's why it's not that, and it doesn't correlate. I think this is probably the biggest thing we have to teach, is that it doesn't correlate directly with the buyer's market, seller's market. It's a whole other view into what's going on in the marketplace.
And finally, are the 6 home type categories given index values available at the zip code level?
Part of what now that we've got the zip code map, which was a big push to get through to the zip code level, our team working with Bright MLS is looking at the data at the zip code level to see what level of indexing we can do on top of that. Because keep in mind, every time we do this, we take all the market activity, all the views, all the showings, everything going up. And so the first thing we're doing is we're slicing it all into zip codes. We're taking this big amount of information, we're slicing it into zip codes. And every time you slice up the data, there's a little less data to work with. And so we're now looking at probably the most popular zip codes, the ones that have a lot of listings, a lot of inventory, a lot of showings, a lot of activity, and saying, can we slice those further and dive into a zip code and say, within this zip code, can we reliably produce an index for, a single family home at a certain price point? And we haven't made that determination yet, and that's probably going to be at a zip code by zip code basis. And it will likely be the ones that have a lot of inventory, have a lot of activity, and where we're confident we can give you a view into the demand with the amount of data that we're getting. But it's a great question, and it's on point as far as the limits of what we can do with the data that we have about what the consumers are doing.
Thanks so much for that, Jack. Now, we're about at the end of our time together, so I just want to reiterate that you'll find a recording of this presentation at youtube.com/brightmls after this session. Again, there's support and articles, videos, and handouts available integrated right into your menu and right into homedemandindex.com. Step-by-step instructions at support.brightmls.com. And our customer success coaches are happy to bring a more localized view of this to your offices. Just reach out to them. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. Have a bright day.